I built the largest steel empire in the world with a habit most people would call obsessive. Every night before I slept, I wrote, not letters, not diary entries, not creative fiction. I wrote numbers, cost per ton of steel produced, profit margin on each rail, efficiency of each furnace, output of each worker, price of iron ore, cost of transportation, wages paid, revenue generated. Every single number that mattered to my business, I tracked every night, without fail, for decades. People thought I was mad. My partners thought I was paranoid. My competitors thought I was wasting time. They were wrong. That habit, the habit of knowing, is what separated me from every other steel manufacturer in America. It's what allowed me to crush competitors who were bigger, older, and better funded. It's what turned a poor Scottish immigrant into the richest man in the world. But let me tell you where this habit came from. Because it didn't start with steel, it started with survival. I was 13 years old, working in a textile factory basement in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, bobbin boy, the lowest position in the factory. My job was to change spools of thread on the spinning machines, 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, $1.20 a week. The factory was dark. The air was thick with cotton dust. The machines were so loud you couldn't think, and the work was so repetitive that your mind went numb. Most workers just endured it. They showed up, they worked, they collected their wages, they went home. But I watched how the factory operated. I watched which machines broke down most often. I watched which workers were fastest. I watched how the foreman organized the work. I watched how the owner calculated costs. And I started counting. How many spools did I change in an hour? How much thread was on each spool? How many machines were running? How much product was the factory producing? How much was each worker paid? How much was the owner making? I didn't write it down yet. I couldn't afford paper, but I counted in my head. I memorized. I calculated. And slowly I began to see something that the other workers couldn't see. I began to see the machine underneath the machine. The factory wasn't just a place where cloth was made. It was a mathematical equation. Inputs and outputs, costs and revenues, efficiency and waste. And whoever understood the equation controlled the factory. This is where the habit began, not with ambition, not with strategy, but with curiosity, with the simple question, how does this actually work? When I became a telegraph messenger boy at 14, I brought the habit with me. I would run messages across Pittsburgh, delivering telegrams to banks, law offices, investment firms, factories. And while I ran, I watched and I counted. How many messages did I deliver to each company? Which companies received the most messages? What time of day were they busiest? What kind of information was being transmitted? I started to see patterns. The companies that received the most telegrams were the companies making the most deals. The offices that sent urgent messages early in the morning were the ones moving fastest. The firms that communicated constantly with other cities were the ones expanding. I wasn't just delivering messages. I was mapping the invisible network of commerce in Pittsburgh, and I was learning something fundamental about wealth. Information is structure, and if you can see the structure, you can predict the future. When I became a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad at 17, the habit intensified. I didn't just operate the telegraph, I studied every message that came through. I tracked shipment volumes. I noted which routes were busiest. I observed which cargo was most profitable. I calculated how much revenue each line generated. The other operators thought I was strange. Why was I writing everything down? Why did I care about numbers that weren't my responsibility? Because I understood something they didn't. The person who knows the numbers controls the decisions. Thomas Scott, my superintendent, noticed. He would ask me questions about operations and I could answer instantly. How many tons of freight moved through Pittsburgh last month? How much did we pay in wages on the Western Division? What was our most profitable route? I knew, not because I had a photographic memory, but because I had been tracking everything, and Scott started to trust me, not because I worked hard, everyone worked hard, but because I knew things that other people didn't know. He started bringing me into meetings, explaining decisions, testing my understanding, and eventually offering me opportunities to invest. This is the secret that most people miss about success. Success is not about working harder than everyone else. It's about knowing more than everyone else. And knowing requires a habit, a daily practice, a discipline that never stops. When Scott offered me a chance to invest in the Adams Express Company, I didn't just say yes, I studied it first. I tracked the company's shipments. I calculated their revenue per route. I estimated their growth potential based on railroad expansion plans. My mother mortgaged our house for $500, everything we had, and I invested it based on numbers I had calculated myself. Not hope, not faith, not luck, numbers. The investment returned dividends almost immediately, and I learned something that would define my entire approach to wealth. The habit of knowing gives you an edge that capital alone cannot buy. Rich men had more money than me. They could make bigger bets. But I had something they didn't have. I had granular knowledge. I knew the details. I understood the mechanisms. I could see inefficiencies they couldn't see because I was tracking things they ignored. When I started investing in iron companies, I didn't just buy stock. I visited the operations. I counted the inventory. I timed the production processes. I calculated the yield per ton of ore. When I invested in bridge companies, I studied the engineering. I calculated the material costs. I compared stone bridges to iron bridges. I projected future demand based on railroad expansion. When I invested in oil, I tracked production volumes, transportation costs, refining efficiency, market prices. Every investment was based on numbers I had calculated myself, numbers I tracked, numbers I understood, and the habit grew stronger. By the time I was 30, I had notebooks filled with data, cost structures for different industries, profit margins for various companies, efficiency metrics for competing operations, market trends over time. I wasn't just investing, I was building a knowledge base, a personal intelligence system that gave me advantages no one else had. And when I founded my first steel company in 1873, the habit became the foundation of everything I built. Let me tell you what made Carnegie Steel different from every other steel company in America. It wasn't better technology. Other companies had good technology. It wasn't cheaper labor. Other companies had cheap labor. It wasn't better locations. Other companies had good locations. What made us different was that I knew my costs, not approximately, not generally, exactly. I knew the cost per ton of steel produced in each furnace. I knew the efficiency of each blast furnace. I knew the output of each shift. I knew the wages of each worker. I knew the cost of each input: iron, ore, coal, limestone. I knew the transportation cost per mile. I knew the profit margin on each product. I knew everything. And because I knew everything, I could optimize everything. Most steel companies operated on intuition. They knew roughly what things cost. They had a general sense of profitability, but they didn't know precisely. I knew precisely. I installed cost accounting systems that tracked every penny. Every department had to report their costs daily. Every foreman had to justify their spending. Every process had to prove its efficiency. This drove people crazy. My managers hated it. They thought I was micromanaging. They thought I didn't trust them. But it wasn't about trust. It was about knowledge. Because when you know your costs exactly, you can make decisions that are impossible for your competitors. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1876, there was a railroad boom. Demand for steel rails was exploding. Prices were high. Every steel company was trying to maximize production to capture the market. But I did something different. I looked at my cost data and I realized that one of our blast furnaces was significantly less efficient than the others. It was producing steel, but at a cost that was barely profitable at current prices. My partners wanted to run it anyway. The market was hot. We could sell everything we produced, but I shut it down. They thought I was insane. We were leaving money on the table. Competitors were expanding, and we were contracting, but I knew something they didn't. I knew that the railroad boom would end, demand would fall, prices would drop, and when that happened, the companies with the highest costs would go bankrupt first. 2 years later, the boom ended. A depression hit. Steel prices collapsed. Half the steel companies in America went bankrupt. Carnegie still thrived because when prices dropped, our costs were so low that we were still profitable. We bought our bankrupt competitors for pennies on the dollar. We expanded while others contracted, all because I knew my numbers, all because of the habit. But the habit wasn't just about costs. It was about everything. I tracked labor productivity. I knew which workers were most efficient. I knew which shifts performed best. I knew which incentive structures drove the best results. I tracked equipment performance. I knew which furnaces lasted longest. I knew which maintenance schedules prevented breakdowns. I knew when to repair and when to replace. I tracked supplier reliability. I knew which vendors delivered on time. I knew which provided the best quality. I knew which would negotiate and which wouldn't. I tracked market trends. I knew when demand was rising. I knew when prices were about to shift. I knew when to expand and when to consolidate. I knew everything because I tracked everything. And this habit, this obsessive, relentless habit of knowing gave me power that my competitors couldn't match. Let me tell you about vertical integration. Everyone talks about how I vertically integrated my steel operations, how I bought the iron ore mines, the coal mines, the limestone quarries, the railroads, the ships. But no one talks about why I could do it when my competitors couldn't. I could do it because I knew the numbers. I knew exactly how much we paid for iron ore. I knew the profit margin the mine owners were making. I knew that if I owned the mines myself, I could capture that margin. I knew exactly how much we paid for transportation. I knew the profit margin the railroads were making. I knew that if I owned transportation, I could capture that margin. I knew exactly how much we paid for limestone, for coal, for every input in the production process. And I knew that every dollar I paid to a supplier was a dollar of profit I was giving away. So I bought them one by one, mine by mine, railroad by railroad, ship by ship. Not because I was a genius, but because I tracked the numbers long enough to know exactly where the profit was leaking. My competitors couldn't do this, not because they lacked capital, but because they lacked knowledge. They didn't know their costs well enough to know what to buy. They didn't understand their value chain well enough to know where to integrate. I did, because of the habit. But here's what most people don't understand about this habit. It's not just about business, it's about psychology. When you track everything, when you know everything, you eliminate uncertainty. And uncertainty is what makes people make bad decisions. Most business decisions are made emotionally. Fear, greed, pride, panic, hope. But when you know the numbers, you can make decisions rationally, based on data, based on reality. When steel prices dropped and everyone panicked, I didn't panic. I looked at my cost data and realized we were still profitable. So instead of cutting back, I expanded. When competitors offered to buy me out at premium prices, I didn't get greedy. I looked at my growth projections and realized I would make more by staying independent. So I said no. When workers went on strike demanding higher wages, I didn't react emotionally. I looked at labor cost data, productivity metrics, and profit margins. Then I made a decision based on numbers, not anger. The habit of knowing removes emotion from decision making, and emotion is what destroys most businesses. Let me tell you what happened during the panic of 1873. The stock market crashed, banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, the entire American economy collapsed, most businesses stopped expanding, many shut down entirely. I expanded, not because I was brave, not because I was reckless, but because I knew my numbers, and my numbers told me that demand for steel would recover, that railroad construction would resume, that the companies that survived would dominate the market afterward. So while everyone else was cutting costs and selling assets, I was buying. I bought competitors, I bought equipment, I bought resources. It looked insane. People thought I would go bankrupt, but I knew something they didn't. I knew that my cost structure was sustainable even in a depression. I knew that if I expanded while others contracted, I would emerge stronger. And I was right. When the economy recovered, Carnegie Steel was a dominant player in the American steel market, all because of the habit of knowing, the habit of tracking, the habit of calculating. But I want to tell you something that most success stories leave out. This habit has a cost. It consumed my life. Every night tracking numbers, every morning reviewing reports, every meeting asking for data, every decision requiring analysis. It made me difficult to work with. My partners resented the constant questioning. My managers hated the accountability. My workers felt surveilled. It made me obsessive. I couldn't stop. Even when I wasn't at work, I was thinking about cost, efficiency, optimization. I couldn't relax. I couldn't turn it off. It made me ruthless. When the numbers told me to cut wages, I cut wages. When the numbers told me to shut down a facility, I shut it down. When the numbers told me to break a strike, I broke the strike. The habit gave me power, but it also made me hard, cold, calculating, and I can't tell you that it was worth it without acknowledging what it cost. But I can tell you this, the habit works. If you want to build something great, if you want to dominate your industry, if you want to become the best at what you do, you need this habit. You need to know more than your competitors. You need to track what they ignore. You need to understand what they overlook. You need to see what they can't see. And the only way to do that is through daily discipline, through obsessive attention to detail, through relentless tracking and analysis. This is not glamorous. This is not exciting. This is not the part of success that people want to hear about, but it's the part that matters. When I sold Carnegie Steel to JP Morgan for $480 million in 1901, people asked me how I built such a valuable company. I told them about vertical integration, about efficiency, about scale, about timing. I knew my business better than anyone else knew theirs. I knew every cost, every process, every efficiency, every waste, every opportunity. And that knowledge gave me power that money alone couldn't buy. Let me make this practical for you. Let me tell you exactly how to implement this habit in your own life. Start small. You don't need to track everything at once. Start with one thing, one metric that matters to your work or your business. If you're in sales, track your conversion rate. How many calls lead to meetings? How many meetings lead to sales? What's your average deal size? If you're building something, track your costs. How much does it cost to acquire a customer? How much does it cost to produce your product? What's your profit margin? If you're investing, track your returns, not just total returns, but returns by category, by time period, by strategy. Pick one thing, track it daily, write it down, calculate it, understand it, make it a ritual. I tracked my numbers every night before bed. It became a ritual, a non-negotiable part of my day. Find a time that works for you. Morning, evening, during lunch. It doesn't matter. What matters is consistency. Every day, without fail. No excuses. Because the power of this habit doesn't come from tracking once. It comes from tracking repeatedly, over time, until patterns emerge, until insights appear, until you know your numbers better than anyone else. Look for patterns numbers. By themselves are just data. The power comes from seeing patterns. Which days are most productive? Which strategies work best? Which costs are increasing? Which efficiencies are declining? Track long enough and you'll start to see things that other people can't see. You'll predict problems before they happen. You'll identify opportunities before they're obvious. Act on what you learn. This is the most important part. The habit is worthless if you don't act on what you learn. When you identify inefficiency, eliminate it. When you discover opportunity, pursue it. When you see patterns, adjust your strategy. The habit of knowing only matters if it changes your behavior. I didn't just track my costs. I used cost data to make decisions, to shut down unprofitable operations, to invest in efficient ones, to outmaneuver competitors. Know, then act. That's a sequence. That's the power. Never stop. I tracked numbers for 50 years. From the telegraph office to the sale of Carnegie steel. I never stopped. Because the moment you stop tracking is the moment you start losing your edge. Markets change. Competitors adapt. Efficiency degrades. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. The habit has to be permanent, not a phase, not a temporary experiment, a lifelong practice. This is what separates the great from the good. The good have insights, the great have systems. The good react to problems, the great prevent them. The good rely on intuition, the great rely on data. And the only way to build that system, to prevent those problems, to have that data is through the daily habit of tracking, analyzing, and knowing. When I look back at my life, at the empire I built, at the wealth I accumulated, at the competitors I defeated, I don't attribute it to genius. I don't attribute it to luck. I don't attribute it to vision. I attribute it to the habit. The secret habit that most people thought was obsessive. The habit that drove my partners crazy. The habit that consumed my evenings and occupied my mind. The habit of knowing. Every night before I slept, I wrote numbers. And those numbers built an empire. Not because numbers are magical, but because knowing gives you power. Knowledge gives you edge. Data gives you certainty in a world of uncertainty. And in business, the person with the most certainty wins. I was a poor immigrant boy with nothing but a working brain and a pair of hands. I became the richest man in the world. not through harder work, not through better connections, not through inherited wealth, through a simple habit, a daily practice, an obsessive discipline, the habit of knowing more than anyone else. That's the secret. That's what built my empire. That's what separated me from every other steel manufacturer in America, and it's available to anyone willing to do the work. Track, analyze, know, act, repeat every day without fail, for years, for decades. Do that and you'll have an advantage that capital can't buy and competitors can't match. You'll have knowledge, and knowledge, when acted upon consistently, becomes wealth. That's the secret habit that built my empire. Now go build yours. But the real answer was simpler.